Hi everyone, it's Lauren and this is my September reading wrap-up video. In this video I'm going to discuss all of the books that I've read last month and do some mini reviews of them. So before we get started, there's one book which I started and didn't finish, and I could not mention this in this video, but I just feel like you've got to be real, and sometimes you don't finish books, and that is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. Now this is one of the Penguin Great Ideas books, and I got a couple of these volumes from my friend for my birthday, so I thought I would try some out. The big question in this essay is whether or not life is worth living, essentially. And some of the points that he was making I did find very interesting, but as someone who's never studied any philosophy before, and this is kind of the first philosophical essay I've tried to read, I did find it very inaccessible. So I don't know if any of you have studied this at university or have attempted to read it or found it very easy to read / very hard to read. I felt like he was referring to a lot of other philosophers and a lot of other schools of thought that I wasn't familiar with, so therefore I found like I couldn't get on board with what then Camus was trying to say. So maybe I need perhaps a philosophy 101 kind of book beforehand. So it's a shame. I would like to try this book again at another point, but for now it is being sidelined. So the first book I actually finished in September was The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jane Campbell. This is a proof copy. This is a collection of short stories which is out on the 2nd of November. I really love this collection. It spans a lot of different themes and all of the stories are very different. Some of them are written in different styles. For example, we have one that's written like a play, one that's in the form of a letter, but all of them play with themes of fairy tales and that transition between childhood and adulthood and different perspectives on the world. There's a lot of magical realism in here, a lot of very bizarre stories or bizarre premises, interesting facts from around the world which the different characters are kind of dropping in as part of their stream of consciousness. And what I really loved was seeing Jen's writing in a longer form, because it has retained the elements of poetry and imagination that she has in her poems, and it was nice seeing that explored a little bit further and a little bit deeper. My favourite story was Margaret and Mary at the End of the World, which deals with themes of virginity and pregnancy and eating disorders, like a woman's body, really, kind of what a woman's body is for and who owns it. And I always find it quite interesting how she manages to put lots of different themes and different ideas within such a small space. So I really love this book. I'll put it down, I'll give some time to the other books for a little bit, but yeah, I would really recommend checking this out when it comes out in November. Next we have Tin Man by Sarah Winman, who is the author of When God Was a Rabbit, and I think that had quite a lot of hype when it came out a few years ago. I never actually got around to reading it myself, but now that I've read this, that is definitely going on my TBR as well. This is about the relationship primarily between two young boys, Ellis and Michael, in I guess the 60s and 70s in the north of England, and then how that relationship changes when a woman called Annie enters their lives, and it's about the friendship / relationship that all three of them have with each other. The story is mostly told from Ellis's point of view when he's older and he's kind of looking back on his past, but we also get some chapters from Michael's perspective as well. And it spans a lot of themes. Again, this is about love in general and love in very wide terms. A lot of different characters in here have different relationships with different people, and they're either finding happiness with their partners or they're not. And it's about different forms of love and how you show that love with people, and that's in relationships, in friendships, and with parents and children as well. So I think there's a lot in here, and yet the prose is so quiet, and the way I'm kind of reading it, it's one of those books that sneaks up on you, and at the end of the book I realised how emotionally invested I was in it, and it is a little bit weepy, and I hadn't even realised that while I was reading it, because she just kind of takes you along and the plot kind of slowly unfolds, but it doesn't shy away from big issues. Like, we talk about the AIDS crisis in here, but it does focus more on the ordinariness of that and the ordinariness and amazingness of everyday life. That's kind of how I would sum up this book. Next, I fancied some non-fiction, so I picked up They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery, which is a look at the development of the Black Lives Matter movement, or all of the different activist movements in the US, which have kind of collectively can be put under the Black Lives Matter umbrella. Wesley Lowery is a journalist, and this book is part his own story about how he got more and more involved in the demonstrations, in covering the demonstrations that were happening in the US. Specifically, of course, looking at the black people in the US who are continually killed by the police or dying in police custody without any of the officers being brought to charges over that. So we start from the demonstrations in Ferguson and how the sentiment in that community really spread across America in response to other incidents which kept happening. And what I really liked about this is that it's a very neat, concise book which shows how that developed, because we all kind of saw it happening, especially in the UK. I obviously didn't see it as much as someone who is within the US, I imagine, but it's quite good to have this all put together in a very, very recent history and study of how that changed and how this movement kind of got born. But what Wesley Lowery does really well is that he makes sure that he includes comments from all different people, so the families of the victims in some cases, members of the local communities, all of the activists that have started various movements, the different people that were giving him information and his sources. So that means that this isn't really one person's tale, it does feel like a community story, and you're getting all of these different voices and you're piecing together different pieces of the puzzle to kind of get a better view as to what really happened. So I found this absolutely fascinating. It was written in 2016, I think, so it spans about 2 to 3 years of recent history, but a very worthwhile read indeed, especially if you're on the outside of these events like I am. I then picked up Hagseed by Margaret Atwood. This is part of the Hogarth Shakespeare series, where lots of different authors have been invited to write adaptations of Shakespeare plays, and this is Margaret Atwood's spin on The Tempest. This book is so self-aware to the point where sometimes I felt like it was a little bit gratuitous, because our Prospero character from The Tempest is Felix, who was a theatre director who gets bumped by some other people in his company, and then part of his revenge surrounds him putting on a production of The Tempest in a prison. So he's part of a theatre programme which brings Shakespeare into prisons, and he's working with all the inmates. So it's very weird that Felix is aware that he is casting himself in his own version of The Tempest, and he had a small daughter called Miranda who died when she was 3, and it's kind of about him grieving for her and coming to terms with that, and then also getting back to his previous position in society. But the fact that he knows what The Tempest is, and he's putting on a production of The Tempest, and he's aware about how his life might be a reenactment of The Tempest itself, is a little bit weird. But I loved it. I was fully on board with it, especially because when Felix is teaching The Tempest to the prisoners, he talks about lots of different themes, all of the different characters, people are quoting lines from the play all of the time, and it was so interesting. I mean, I found it really fascinating, but that's because I quite like The Tempest and I enjoyed looking at all of these different examinations of themes. However, I can't really imagine, if you haven't read The Tempest, that you would get as much out of this book as I did. And I only say that because at times I feel like if you didn't know the story already, I feel like almost this would be like reading a textbook where they're explaining to you what The Tempest is, because they talk about the characters and everything so much that it really helps having a prior knowledge of the play, especially because this is so layered and it's a play within a play within a play almost. There's lots of different characters that you can identify as the characters. In Shakespeare's play, for example, there's about 3 or 4 different people that you could say, oh, you are the Ariel within this adaptation. So I think if you didn't know the play already, you might lose some of that, but I don't know, I would love to hear from you if you read this and you didn't know The Tempest. I'd be really interested to see how you enjoyed it. And finally, another book that I very, very much enjoyed, and that was The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Cannon. This book is set in the summer of 1976 in England, so I've read it just in time really, because we're just getting into autumn now, and the heat is such a character in this book that I think if I'd read this in maybe like December, it kind of would have lost a little bit of its punch. I think this book might be the embodiment of my favourite kind of writing, because it's so easy to read. You absolutely whiz through it, but it's very, very clever, and it's that kind of prose which you don't even realise how clever it is and how poetic and imaginative it is, because it's so easy to read. And I feel like that is such a skill, especially when you combine the fact that the story in this is very normal, very ordinary. All of the characters are very English. It's very kitchen sink drama-esque, and that's the kind of story I think I love, because it's so normal and yet the writing is fantastic. This is about a small street in the north of England, and a woman, Margaret Creasy, has just not come home one day. She's disappeared, disappeared. And so it's the summer holidays, and two young girls, Grace and Tilly, decide that they're going to find out what happened to Margaret Creasy. And the way they're going to do this is that they think that they need to find God, because if they find God down the street somewhere, then God will look after everybody and stop anyone else from disappearing. So that's the main story, but what we're really doing is looking at all of the different people down this street, all of the secrets that they have, and whether Margaret Creasy's disappearance is related to something that happened a few years ago. So there is a little bit of dual timeline in this. We jump from 1976 to 1967, but most of it is set in 1976. We just have a few flashbacks, and I just loved it. It's very funny. The characters themselves are such like an embodiment of English humour and eccentricity, but also at the same time being so very, very ordinary. And I think I would really recommend this book, especially actually if you've read The Museum of You by Caris Bray. I think this book is very similar to that, not just in the content of it being kind of England in the summer holidays, but also it's very much that kind of prose, which I find absolutely delightful, in that it seems very unassuming, and then there'll just be these flashes of wit, or a very imaginative turn of phrase, or its perceptions of character. And I think the only reason I wouldn't recommend this right now is that now that we're in autumn and this isn't really the season for this book, but other than that, I don't think I could fault it. So there we are. I would love to know what you've been reading in September. I would especially like to know if you've read any of these books. I'd like to hear your thoughts on them. What are you planning to read in October? And I will see you in my next video. Bye!